Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is presented by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, the industry's #1 specialty travel company and the fly shop for the world of fly fishing. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now your host, author, photographer, and world traveler, Jim Klug.
Welcome to Waypoints, where today we have the privilege of sitting down with a true icon of Yellowstone fly fishing, Craig Mathews. A name synonymous with the waters of Yellowstone National Park and West Yellowstone, Montana, Craig has spent decades exploring, fishing, and advocating for this unparalleled fishery. His intimate knowledge of the region and its wild trout waters has shaped the experiences of countless anglers who have come to fish and discover one of the most storied landscapes in the world. Craig's journey to become a fly fishing legend is as unique as the waters he's fished. Before immersing himself fully in the fly fishing world, he served as chief of police in West Yellowstone, a role that gave him an up-close view of life in one of the most rugged and beautiful corners of the country. But it was his deep love for wild trout and conservation that led him, in 1980, to found Blue Ribbon Flies, a shop that quickly became a cornerstone of the fly fishing community. With a passion for both tradition and innovation, Craig helped pioneer new fly patterns, techniques, and approaches to fishing Yellowstone's dynamic waters. His expertise, generosity, and commitment to education have inspired generations of anglers who seek to explore and find success on these hallowed waters. Beyond his impact on the sport itself, Craig has been a tireless advocate for conservation. His efforts to protect and preserve the fisheries of Yellowstone and beyond have been instrumental in safeguarding wild trout and their habitats. As a co-founder of 1% for the Planet project, he has championed environmental responsibility, ensuring that businesses and anglers alike give back to the lands and waters that provide so much. In total, Craig has authored or co-authored 9 significant books on fishing, contributing extensively to the literature and knowledge surrounding fly fishing in the Yellowstone area. And from his writings and films to his hands-on conservation work, Craig's influence extends far beyond the banks of the Madison or Firehole. His legacy is one of stewardship, passion, and an unwavering belief that wild places and wild fish deserve our respect and protection. In this episode, we'll dive into Craig's decades of exploring and fishing Yellowstone, his journey from law enforcement to fly shop owner, and his deep-rooted conservation ethos. We'll hear his thoughts on the current state of Yellowstone's fisheries, the lessons he's learned from a lifetime on the water, and his vision for the future of fly fishing. We'll be right back with Craig Mathews after this word from our sponsor. Waypoints is sponsored by Patagonia. To bring their gear to life, Patagonia is motivated by relentless curiosity and a passion for the wild. They evaluate hundreds of materials, build dozens of prototypes, and spend seasons punishing them in the world's most extreme conditions. The work is the guide, and Patagonia never tires of exploring, learning, and improving. Be sure to check out Patagonia's new Swift Current waders, repatterned and redesigned for bulk reduction, reduced seam stress, increased maneuverability, and improved repairability. Made from recycled materials without intentionally added PFAS, Swift Current waders move better in and out of the water. Welcome back to Waypoints. We are here with our guest today, Craig Mathews. Craig, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's great to finally sit down. It's been a long time coming, but I want to start off by asking you kind of your early background, Craig, where you grew up and when you first started fishing. How did a young Craig Mathews first find his way to this sport?
You know, I was really fortunate. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we had a summer home up on a lake called Silver Lake, north and west of Grand Rapids. We had great fishing there for basically warm water species, bluegills and rock bass and largemouth bass, smallmouth bass. And again, that's how I kind of cut my teeth on fly fishing, fishing little rubber spiders and rubber poppers to warm water species. And these two old men kind of took me under their wing. They had little summer homes as well next to ours, and they'd wade out every night and catch bluegills. And I showed up one day with an old cane fly rod that my grandfather gave me, and they gave me a few tips. And it wasn't long after we were kind of cruising around. My mother would take us for drives in the afternoon. My dad was in the drugstore business in Grand Rapids. He'd come up on weekends. So my mother would cruise around with us kids during the day, and we caught these two old guys that taught me how to fish poppers to bluegills sneaking out of the woods one day along this little stream. And after they left, I got out of the car and I walked back and I found this little pond that was loaded with brown and brook trout. I did not, at that time, even know what a trout was. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. Anyway, and I snuck back there with a can of worms one day. My brother was a year younger, and we both caught brook trout and a small brown trout, and I was immediately hooked by, the beautiful, just by the beautiful fish that we caught. From there, basically, I got into fly fishing. Tied my first fly when I was 7 or 8 years old out of a seagull feather, and caught a little bluegill on it. I was hooked for life.
The rest is history.
The rest is history.
Pretty amazing. Well, I want to hear how you found your way to the West from Michigan and kind of your unique path into the world of professional fly fishing. You, in the early days in Montana, didn't set out to be a guide or a focused fly fisherman. You were in law enforcement. Tell us about that career and how that started.
A long story short. I went to Michigan State University and graduated with a degree in criminal justice, went on to work on a master's degree, dual master's program, one in criminal justice and one in education. And I'm cruising along, and as I'm in graduate school, I decided to go to law school. And a real long story short, I apply to law school, get accepted. While I'm waiting to crank up law school, my draft board calls me, and that's during the Vietnam era. And I'd been had a student deferment. Well, my draft board called me in, and they said, you're applicable to go into the selective service, into the draft. And I drew, that was the first draft lottery. And I drew 267. And they said, you might as well just drop out right now of law school because we don't give a deferment for that. So I dropped out of law school. They told me that they were going to go way beyond 267. Well, they were 265. They didn't touch me. So my old college roommate said, you know what? You ought to get involved in law enforcement. Get these 2 master's degrees and 5 years police experience, and you can teach law enforcement in a community college. You can fish and hunt all you want. I said, that's for me.
Sign me up.
Yeah. So that's when I went back to graduate school. And then I got involved in law enforcement. I was a police officer, and my wife, Jackie, we weren't married at the time, but she was a police dispatcher. And we spent some time in Yellowstone. We'd save our overtime and come to Yellowstone National Park in the fall for as long as a month with our overtime. We didn't pay for it. We took comp time and a half. And one year, this would have been 1978, in the fall, I'm sitting there tying flies, and at that time I was tying flies for Bud Lilly, who owned the famous fly shop, the trout shop in West Yellowstone, Montana. And Jackie and I are sitting there tying flies, and she goes, you know what? We're moving to Montana. I said, well, what are we going to do? She said, we'll work for the police department around Yellowstone. So she calls the West Yellowstone Police Department. I'll never forget. And I thought she was kidding me. I didn't think she was talking to anybody. I thought she just, was fooling with me. Well, she gives me the phone, and she said, they hired me as a dispatcher. They need a cop right now. And next thing I know, I'm talking to the police chief at that time, Harry Wasserman, who said, I need you to fly out to Bozeman. I'll pick you up, and you need to interview. And my eyes are spinning. I'm going, Jesus Christ, we didn't even talk this over. But that's how we operated back then. A wing and a prayer. A week later, we land in Bozeman in February. It was 55 degrees, much like today, sunny, beautiful. I said, we're moving here. Well, my old outfit gave me 1 year off. They said, you can go and be the police chief. Then you can come back after a year and work here. I was kind of a golden boy, if you will.
They thought you might not go the distance in Montana and might want to come home.
Yep, and work up the ladder and work up to a supervisory position. Well, we came to Montana and bought a place sight unseen, a little mobile home, and moved into it in late February, first part of March. And the rest is history. We decided after a year we weren't going back, and we stayed, and I held the record for the longest lasting police chief they ever had for many, many years.
Well, I can imagine late 70s in West Yellowstone, you must have some good stories, bikers, brothels. I mean, it must kind of been a little bit of everything from those days.
It was a little bit of everything. And my good friend Tom Brokaw, who at that, a retired NBC Nightly News, has conned me into writing a book about my old police chief experience, and that's still in the works.
Well, we're all looking forward to reading that. I'm sure there's some pretty great stories.
Oh, there's some great stories.
Those early days. Well, you had been a fly fisherman. It's kind of what brought you to Montana initially, into the park. Now you've got a career. You've got your job with law enforcement. Jackie's working as a dispatcher. You guys have made the move to Montana. When did you transition from law enforcement to the thought of, hey, we can actually start a business and go all in on fly fishing?
Well, there had been 36 police chiefs before me, and the town had incorporated in the early 1960s. And I knew I was kind of on borrowed time. I wasn't going to last long making $9,000 a year, nor was she making $2.30 an hour as a dispatcher. So the thought always struck me. My sister was born with spina bifida, a terrible birth defect. And I taught her how to tie flies, and she taught she worked for the social rehab with the state of Michigan. And I had this idea of starting a wholesale fly tying business using handicap fly tyers. And one day, the then fire chief, who also owned a big restaurant in town, pulled me over and he said, "How long are you going to last as a police chief?" And I said, "Well, probably not all that much longer, but I got an idea for a business." He said, "I'll be over in a minute." So he shows up at our house. He said, "I got a few bucks to invest. Let's talk about it." And less than 24 hours later, they were digging the hole for blue ribbon flies. We went up to Helena, interviewed some disabled young people up there, brought them back, taught them how to tie flies. And at one time, we had as many as 46 fly tyers. And we became involved in the wholesale fly tying business. We tied for Orvis, LL Bean, and some Eddie Bauer stores in Chicago and whatnot.
Well, what were some of the biggest challenges those first couple of years in launching and growing the shop and the fly tying business? And you're probably like, oh, God, where do I start? But some of the ones that you really remember as far as, being kind of difficult and challenging.
Well, the first one was just getting a wholesale customer. I went out, and a good friend of mine, Nick Lyons, the author and publisher, and he became a really close friend. And Nick says, I will help you. I met him in West Yellowstone fishing, and I guided him when I worked for Bud Lilly part-time as a fishing guide, along with my police chief responsibilities. And Nick said, let me find out if I can't help you. And Nick Lyons got us the Orvis account as well as an account with LL Bean. And that's what really kind of launched us. That initial challenge of just getting some customers, also teaching non-fly tying people who never even saw a hook, let alone a fly tying place, how to tie flies. But we were so lucky, so fortunate that they stuck with it. We stuck with it, and we got some wholesale accounts, and away we went. And we were strictly wholesale for the first couple of years.
Before you had a retail facility, only wholesale? Strictly
wholesale. And we were on the north edge of town, way out on the north edge of town on Highway 191, and everybody said, well, you're lucky you're not open to retail because you wouldn't sell a doggone fly out at this location. And we weren't interested in retail. Well, then we had truck drivers stopping in the middle. We were open 24/7 with our fly tying operation. And truck drivers would stop in for coffee and they'd buy a few flies. And finally, Bud Lilly decided to sell his store in 1982. And I was thinking about retiring as the police chief at that same time. So we decided, all right, Bud, if you're leaving your business, we'll crank up ours and we'll go retail. And the challenge was back then is how were people going to find us? You know, we were several blocks from the heart of West Yellowstone. But again, we were so fortunate. Nick Lyons wrote about us. Ed Zern wrote a big piece about us in Field and Stream. And away we went. And that's how people found. We started doing fly fishing shows and speaking engagements. And we met some really influential people along the way. And Bud Lilly helped us, as did Nick Lyons, Tom Brokaw. People like that really helped us kind of launch our retail business.
Icons of the sport, and
yes.
Very connected.
Very connected, yes.
Well, eventually, Blue Ribbon Flies grows, and it becomes this iconic hub for fly anglers, and especially for fly tyers from all over the world. And for years, a trip to Montana and to the West Yellowstone area was not complete without a visit to West Yellowstone to spend time in your shop. I know as a young angler, when I was going back and forth across the country, driving from Oregon to New Hampshire for college, I would always make a point of coming through West just to stop in Blue Ribbon Flies, load up on tying materials, and just kind of hang out in the shop and watch you guys, see everybody that was tying, and see all of the people that would be coming and going from the shop. I mean, it was this epicenter of activity in those days, and it was iconic.
Yeah, and that's what tickled me, was how people connected with us by fly tying materials and innovative fly patterns. And we were so lucky to have some of the best people in the world come and work for us and come and become friends. And not only several college kids, one went on, he's the president now of Coe College Law School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A couple young bankers that started their career just tying flies for us. Authors, we were so lucky in having the right people that came and worked for us, and that spread the word as well.
It was a who's who in those days. I mean, you never knew who you were going to run into in the shop.
Totally, yeah. I remember Tom Brokaw would come in wearing a hat and sunglasses, and no one would know him until he said one word, and then boom, everybody was on him.
Every head in the shop would turn and be like, I recognize that voice.
Yep.
Well, you guys were always known for having the best materials in the entire region, and it wasn't just ordering it from a wholesale company and stocking some shelves. I mean, you guys were vested in this as commercial tyers, as people that were really driving so much of the development of these Western patterns, and especially for the greater Yellowstone area. And over the years, you and your team helped develop some legendary patterns. Can you tell us about a few that you're most proud of, some of the flies, the patterns that originated during those Blue Ribbon years?
Sure. We were so fortunate to have John Jurasek come to work for us back in May of 1982. I'll never forget May 17th at 12 noon. I was a heavy smoker, and I had contracted this terrible cold, and I put out my cigarette. I said, "That's the last cigarette."
You remember the date?
And I remember that date. And John walked into the shop, and I hired him immediately because he said he was a fly tyer, and I looked at his flies. And he and I sat down and really started to figure out some viable fly patterns to fool ultra-selective trout, whether they be on the Henry's Fork and some of the area spring creeks like the Sparkle Dun. Everybody gives us credit for the X-Caddis. My wife, Jackie, was the one that invented the X-Caddis. She just said, if the Sparkle Dun works for emerging mayflies, why don't you do the same thing with caddis? And we put a shuck out and a deer hair wing, and bingo, it worked like a dream. And, of course, the Iris caddis, patterns like that. And then, of course, from there on, we got involved in bone fishing and some of the patterns that we developed for bone fishing as well.
And you were a long-time contract tyer for Umpqua. That's what, you would create these patterns, and then that's what put them out into the world. So it went way beyond the West Yellowstone and the Yellowstone region. The whole world of trout fishing was getting their hands on your flies.
Well, and that's another story of luck. A very good customer of ours was Dan Callahan, and Dan was the legal representative for Umpqua. And we're tying these flies, and Dan is going, my God, these things are killer on the Henry's. You've got to become a contract tyer. I said, what the heck's that? And myself and Jack Gartside had just started the American Fly Tyers Guild, where, not to talk politics, but we actually went and forced through Pat Williams, our U.S. representative here in Montana, the labeling of flies. And Umpqua kind of fought us, but we developed a great relationship with Umpqua because hey, we all put our underwear and our waders on the same way. And we sat down and figured it out. And that's where fly labeling came from at the time. And, and I think it's still a viable, people have a right to know where's that fly created and where's it tied. So
that's right. And during this time, you guys were also introducing new materials. I mean, reaching out to companies like DuPont and figuring out synthetics and, things that really hadn't been done on that level for trout flies at that point.
Yeah, I'll never forget. We had a sample of a material called Zelon, and the inside of the cone used to come in on cones, 22-pound bolts on a cone, and it said Zelon, and it was developed by DuPont. So I thought, what the heck, I'm going to call DuPont. So I called DuPont, and they continue to kind of pass the buck, put me through several phone calls. Finally, I get the right guy, and I hear this, you're a goddamn fly tire, aren't you? And I said, yeah. He said, this stuff works pretty well, doesn't it? He was using it for wings. He said, unfortunately, we don't make Zelon anymore. I go, you got to be kidding me. He said, but I have a pallet of it. I have 586 pounds of it. And he said, I'll sell you that pallet of it. And I'm thinking, oh, my God. He said, the shipping is going to be, it cost us like not even $1 a pound. So a good friend of mine at that time, John Betts from Denver, hell of a fly tire, John and us split that pallet of Zelon, and that was, 40 years ago. And the rest is history.
Well, we used to drive, and that's one of the things we stocked up on was the cards of Zelon. You had it in all different colors that you guys had dyed, and that was back in the the advent of the serendipity.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that was just crushing trout all over the West. And you went to Blue Ribbon Flies to buy your Zelon.
Yep.
It was amazing. Well, how has the fly fishing industry, from your perspective, evolved over the years since you first started the shop? What are things like today versus when you got into the game all those years ago?
Oh, God. Well, look at the advances within the fly fishing business. Look at from a wader standpoint, fly lines that last forever, that float like a cork. Thank God for Rio and Cortland and Scientific Angler. Look at the materials, the wide variety of materials. I'm struck. I walked into the shop here a few minutes ago and went, there's a goddamn wall of beads.
A whole wall.
There's a whole wall of beads. Back then, I'll never forget the first beads we saw. John and I and Jackie were sitting in the shop late one afternoon, and a Japanese fly tire walks in, and he said, I just killed him, in very broken English, I just killed him between Hebgen and Quake Lake on the Madison on this bead head. And we looked at that and went, no way.
You're like, what's a bead head?
Yeah.
No way any respectable trout is going to eat that.
But look how things have changed in terms of fly patterns, materials, synthetics. It's getting harder and harder and more challenging to get natural materials, whether they be Hungarian partridge, quail, those kind of skins. But that's something that I still work hard at, and I make sure that the skins get to my old fly shop and other fly shops as well.
Well, you touched on this a minute ago, and I want to backtrack for just a second. Aside from your trout focus for all those years, from a destination and travel perspective, you've been a longtime passionate saltwater angler as well. You've traveled for years, even the early years before people were getting on planes and going to places like Belize and the Yucatan. I know you were very close with Craig Hayes. You organized a lot of hosted trips to Turnip Flats back in their early days. I think even when the country was still British Honduras, maybe, before it became Belize. And you, along with your trout patterns, created a number of really effective saltwater patterns that are still in use today. Did you find as much excitement and passion in creating those saltwater patterns as you did the trout patterns for Yellowstone? Oh,
yeah, that's an interesting story, and I'll make it real short. The first time we went to Belize, I'll never forget, it was back in the mid-1980s, and my wife said, will you go on a saltwater trip if I arrange it and organize it? I said, reluctantly, yeah. I was kind of a homebody. I hated to leave Yellowstone. And I'll never forget, she organizes a trip, and we fly to Belize. And it was on Take a Chance Airline, TACA, the airline of Central America.
Oh, yeah, good old TACA.
TACA, and we land, and she goes, are you excited? And I go, nah. We get on board the boat the next day, and we have to make that 20-mile trip out to Turnip Flats. And I'm kind of getting a little keyed up. I'm looking at the crystal clear water, and I'm thinking, this ain't bad in January. Yellowstone's 50 below zero right now, and it's 85 above. Anyway, the first day, we get out of the boat with a guide, and he says, let me see your flies. And I open my fly box, and he goes, Jesus Christ, the same crap you guys show up with. We'll catch a few fish, but why can't you tie some flies that represent what bonefish and permit feed on? I said, well, this really got my interest and my blood pressure up. I said, I'll tell you what, his name was Pops, and I think Pops is still guiding down there.
Pops is still down there.
Yep. Yeah. And Pops, I said, Pops, if you'll show me what fish, bonefish and permit feed on, I will tie flies this year, and I'll come back next year for more than 1 week. He said, we're going to spend the week. He says, now get ready, turn around, there's bonefish coming at 60 feet. And I look out there, and he goes, 60 feet, 11 o'clock cast. And I don't see any bonefish. And I turn around and I wink at Jackie. I go, oh, yeah, bonefish, 60 feet. I'm going, yeah, I hear it. And boom, they blew up right in front of us. I said, here we go. And the rest is history. I got really excited about that. We went back and developed fly patterns like the bonefish bitters and the turnip crab and those patterns. But what started off as a 1 week junket ended up being, we'd spend 6 weeks in Belize and 2 weeks in the Bahamas and maybe 2 weeks in Mexico as well every year chasing bonefish.
Became a lifelong obsession.
Totally.
And led to some really innovative and important fly patterns that are still very much dependent on today.
Yeah, that's good to hear that they're still working.
Oh, yeah. You just named two. I mean, the turnip crab and the bitters, I mean, those are still the go-to patterns at Turnip Atoll and so many of those Caribbean destinations.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, since we do love to talk about travel and adventure on this podcast, when it comes to international travel, Craig, what are some of your all-time favorite destinations?
Oh, God, I used to spend a lot of time, at least 2 weeks, sometimes as many as 4 weeks, fishing dry fly steelhead out of British Columbia on the Skeena, Kispiaks. One of my favorite was the Bulkley, the Dean, rivers like that. I just really enjoyed fishing dry fly steelhead and coming up with viable patterns for them. Again, Mexico, Belize, the Bahamas. I just loved it all.
Yeah. And you've been a lot of places over the years.
Yeah, I have. And I've been really lucky in that regard.
Well, as we like to talk about on the show, it is amazing the places that this sport takes you. And, you know, when you combine that with the fact that fish live in beautiful places, it's not hard to get on an airplane and venture with fly rods in hand and see what's next.
And it's so much fun to introduce people. They used to come in the shop and go, do you think Belize is for me? Or do you think I can catch a steel? And I would say, I guarantee you're going to get hooked. And they got so hooked on bone fishing or permit fishing or tarpon or steelhead, you know. And it's so much fun because it gives them something to look forward to in the wintertime.
Absolutely. And still to this day, I mean, it's an important part of this sport. No
Darn
doubt.
right it is.
Well, getting back to the Yellowstone area, you have now spent decades fishing in and around the park, and were there very much in the early years. I mean, you weren't exactly part of the original Hayden expedition. It doesn't go back that far, but you have certainly been a major pioneer when it comes to fishing in the park. Now, I'm not going to ask you to give away any secrets or hard-earned knowledge, Craig, but do you have a favorite river, or you can just give us a general area in the park that's particularly special to you? You know,
there's two rivers that are super special to me, and they remain so. They have been since 1970, since I first saw them, you know, was that 55 years ago? And that's the Firehole and Madison River. And people go, what? The Firehole? You're going to catch 9 to 12-inch fish. Well, you know what? The fish in the Firehole are getting bigger every year, and they're almost like they used to be. Back when Ernie Schweber talked about catching 4 and 6 pound fish. I'm not saying I catch 4 or 6 pound fish, but last year we caught our share of 18, 19, 20-inch brown trout. And I had an 18.5-inch rainbow that rivaled anything you'd ever hook on the Henry's Fork. They're there, and they're really tough to catch because the myriad of currents that are in the Firehole, they become very selective and hard to fool. The Madison in the park gets a huge run, obviously, of browns and run-up rainbows in the fall. But I enjoy fishing it in the spring when it first clears. And sometimes it's clear even before runoff. It'll fish before runoff. And it gets tremendous early season hatches, pale morning duns, betas, a couple different species of caddis. And, of course, it gets a stonefly hatch as well. And those big run-up fish, some as large as, well, Mickey Wooten caught one a couple years ago, 32 inches long. There's some big fish that come into that lower Madison River.
Well, it is a special piece of water. We had the great fortune of doing a project with you probably 15 years ago or so now. We spent several days in the park fishing. You took us to a spot on the Madison, and I'll never forget this. You said, okay, there's a turnoff here, another quarter mile down the road, there's another turnoff, little parking lot, and that's where the river kind of came close to those parking areas. He said, everybody fishes here. We're going to walk across to the back of this oxbow, and you have to walk through some woods. I remember there was a grizzly that you had encountered numerous times there, but I'll never forget this. He said 99.9% of the people that come and fish in Yellowstone don't leave sight of the pavement. They do not want to get away from seeing their car or being right near the parking area. So you just walk an extra, half mile or even a few hundred yards,
yes,
and you get to water that maybe not completely untouched, but certainly compared to the areas that are right by where everyone wants to park and feel kind of safe by their car, you find amazing fishing.
You sure do. And, one of the greatest things that's present in the park are grizzly bears because they scare the hell out of people. But with precaution, with pepper spray, and with making some noise, you can walk and get off the beaten path, if you will. Several small stream locations, and we'll talk about them tonight in our presentation. But I can think of a dozen places where you'll never see an angler's track, and yet it offers tremendous fishing. And the reason being is most people will not walk in the park. They want to basically fish out of their vehicle.
Yeah, and thank God for those grizzly bears. Keep some of that water untouched.
That's right.
We're trying to do a grizzly bear introduction program here into Bozeman to maybe lessen the crowds here. Well, overall, what in your opinion, and you fished a lot of places around the world, Craig, you've trout fished a lot of places around the world. What makes Yellowstone such a unique world-class fishery and is kind of a standalone destination?
Well, where else can you go and catch wild and native species while you have geysers and fumaroles going off around you, and you have herds of bison, and you may have a grizzly bear walk by, or you may have a cougar walk by? Where else can you go in the world with that kind of wildlife and that kind of wild trout and native trout activity, plus the hatches and the pristine? Yellowstone is so pristine. The water is crystal clear and not polluted. Yellowstone is such a special place.
It's an incredibly special place. A lot of people look at the numbers that come to the park every summer and they say it's way too crowded. I don't want to deal with those crowds. And yeah, if you're fighting for a front row parking spot at Old Faithful, you're going to experience that. But as we said a moment ago, as soon as you leave the pavement, as soon as you're willing to walk into the woods, get even just a little bit into the backcountry, you're going to leave all that behind.
Totally. I'm reminded last year when you said that, I'm reminded of parking along the road, and we had our rod tubes out, and we had to walk about 400 yards to the river, where you'll never see a human track. You'll see a lot of bison, but there we are, and we're getting our rods out of our rod tube. Guy pulls over, and he looks at us, and he goes, "You guys are doing some surveying today, aren't you?" He thought we had surveying equipment.
You're like, mm-hmm.
Not a clue,
Not a clue. Well, tell us about some of the changes you've personally observed in Yellowstone's trout populations over the decades that you have lived and fished in the park. Is it the same? Is it dropped off significantly? Is it getting better in some places? What's your perspective on that?
If you look at the cutthroat situation in the Yellowstone River near Yellowstone Lake and Yellowstone Lake itself, and we noticed a dramatic decrease in the number of Yellowstone cutthroat because of invasive species like the introduction of the lake trout. And there's whirling disease, of course, on Pelican Creek, on the Firehole River, and other places. But with that, we're slowly, because of programs instituted through Yellowstone Forever, and my wife and I were on the board of Yellowstone Forever, which at that time was called the Yellowstone Park Foundation. And we worked hard to secure funding for some programs that really worked hard to eliminate the problem of invasive species like lake trout and whirling disease. And now we're seeing the Yellowstone River bump up a little bit. Last year we saw tons of little 8 to 10 inch cutthroat trout in the middle of the river feeding like wolves. I haven't seen that in 25, 30 years. it's really good to see. The park is telling us that the population is making a little comeback. With that, we remain very hopeful, but we can't drop the ball and let this funding go. We still have to work very hard to make sure that the park service gets the adequate funding to do that. We've seen, obviously, a great influx of fly fishing numbers, a number of fly fishermen that are fishing the park. But again, they fish near the road. They want to cast out of their back seat. And if you have to walk, you're going to catch plenty of wild trout. With that, we've seen populations fluctuate in rivers, particularly the Madison and the park, and it's just a natural fluctuation depending on recruitment. Some years you have very good recruitment. You have very good fishing for the next couple of years. With whirling disease, we definitely saw some decreased numbers, particularly on like Pelican Creek and places like that. But word is, and I haven't fished pelican in a couple of years, but word is it's coming back. And I love to hear that it's coming back. With the West Little Cutthroat program, it's opening up far more opportunities, primarily lakes, Wolf Lake, Grebe Lake, lakes like that are really fishing well. So we're seeing better fishing, I think, certainly the last couple of years, and with good flows, and we're going to have really good flows this year. I think the Yellowstone drainage is about 103% of normal. So that bodes well for recruitment.
Yeah. And, there are still, to that point, you mentioned some lakes, you mentioned some small streams. There are so many overlooked fisheries in that park.
God, it's unbelievable. I'll never forget, though, when we first came, I was so excited. I was so gunned up to start the season. And here it is in February and March. And my wife and I are excited to go fishing. And Charlie Brooks, the old author from West Yellowstone, and Charlie wrote some great fly fishing books. And let me get off that subject for just a minute. Books. We got to get people reading some of that literature that was done years ago, whether it be Howard Back and Fishing Yellowstone Waters, Charlie Brooks, Nymph Fishing for Larger Trout, and Larger Trout for the Western Fly Fisher, Ernie Schwiebert, his books. They're classics, and you can learn so much from them. But, I'll never forget Charlie. We went out to see him, and he sat us down. He says, "Kids, don't try to fish at all because you can't do it in a lifetime." And he was right. I have tried to make a dent in my list of Yellowstone waters. Man, I'm going to tell you, you can't fish it all adequately. You can sure
millions of acres.
Oh my God! And thousands of miles of stream to explore, lakes that never get any pressure, and big fish in them.
Yeah,
I'm getting excited right now. Let's go fishing.
Well, and the things that you discover in the pursuit of these fish in the backcountry. I remember you told the story of the sheep-eater Indians that lived in the park or at times moved through the park, and what they would do with the skull and the horns of the sheep. Tell us a little bit about that and kind of the things you would find in the park related to the sheep-eaters.
I found several ruins in the park, old trappers' cabins that still have some of the old traps and memorabilia in them. But one of the greatest thrills, of course, is finding evidence of Native Americans, of Indians. And the park is literally a Native American and Indian ruin. There are so many Indian sites in the park. And I'm walking along one day, and I find this sheep skull, this bighorn sheep skull, that's literally grown into the crotch of this huge pine tree where it branched off. And I get looking at it, and you can't budge it. And then there are two more exactly like that. And I went and mentioned that to an archaeologist one day, and he goes, "Where is that?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because that is definitely evidence of," and it was really kind of cool because Stanford University came out and did a plug sample, and those are 600 years old. They're artifacts, if you will, of sheep-eater Indians, which were a band of the Shoshone, one of the last tribes to be, if you will, put on reservations. They were very small Indians, and they were very reclusive and lived in the backcountry. But they utilized bighorn sheep horns to make their bows. And their bow and arrows were the most powerful bows and arrows ever recorded, known to man. They're amazing artifacts, if you will. And again, if you walk in the park, you're going to come upon piles of obsidian chips. You may even find points, and you can't take them. You pick them up, you photograph them, and you leave them be. I was fishing one day up on the Gibbon River, and I keep hearing this yelling and screaming. I go, what the heck? And I look, Jackie and I, early in the morning, and there's about 20 people walking at us. And I go, what the heck are they doing? And they're bent over and they're picking stuff up. And it was, I think it was Central Florida or Eastern Florida University, and they were picking up and inventorying points. And you hear them go point, chip, and they were marking every location of the artifacts that they found. It was incredible.
And the park is full of those sites.
Totally full of them.
That is amazing. Well, I want to pivot a little bit and ask you about gear for fishing the Yellowstone area. It's a question we get all the time when people are planning a trip out here, the what to bring. What is kind of your go-to setup? And obviously you've got varied rivers, you've got lakes, you've got tiny creeks, but if you have a go-to Yellowstone setup, the one that, has kind of always been your tried and true for all these years, tell us about that.
Well, I've got two vests. One is the pack vest from Patagonia, and I love that because you can stow rain gear and a bunch of stuff in if you're hiking into, some backcountry lakes. The other is just a real lightweight Patagonia vest. I can't remember the name of it, but it's their latest vest. Very lightweight, plenty of pockets. I like to take a couple of fly boxes. Certainly, it seems like whatever you have with you is not the right fly. So, and you learn by fishing places what to bring. I wore a long visored hat, long bill hat, magnifier, hat eyes, magnifier on it. Can't live without a hat eyes on it. These old eyes. Wader wise, look at the advances in waders. The lightweight Patagonia waders, the 4.0 wading boots are lightweight. You can wear them. I hike in them. Matter of fact, I've elk hunted in my 4.0 wading boots just to say I can do it, and they offer support just like a Kenetrek or a Schnee's boot, if you will. Fly rod, I carry a pack rod, usually just what I call a pack rod, a 4-piece IM6. I wish IM6. I'm sorry, B2 or B3X Winston.
But the IM6 was a great rod.
Oh, my favorite.
So
even the pre-IM6,
Yeah.
that original graphite. I have a 9-foot 3-weight that I just love. Anyway, a reel. Matter of fact, I bought a reel here last year. One of the Orvis CFO. Is it a CFO 3?
Yeah, the classics.
The classic.
Yeah.
Best reel in the world. Lightweight. Put a line on it. I personally fish a weight forward line. I like to fish 4 or 5 weights. A 9-foot Orvis or Umpqua leader. Bring a spool of 4 and 5X tippet. Plenty of damselfly, dragonflies, because if I'm fishing lakes, every lake here has damsels and dragons. Some Calabatus mayflies or some sparkle duns patterns, and away I go.
Can of bear spray, and you're good to go.
You have to have bear spray. And that's one thing. I look at photographs that I have in my presentation. Everybody's got bear spray. I don't care if you're fishing the Madison River, a $3 bridge.
Yeah.
There are grizzly bears out and about any day now. They'll be patrolling for a winter kill.
Yeah, they are about to wake up.
They are about to wake. Some of them never went to sleep this year. So,
Well, conservation, Craig, has always been a huge part of your career and your business. What sparked your passion for protecting these fisheries and wild places? Was this something that you showed up with on your first day in Montana, or was that something that evolved over the years of being connected to Yellowstone and the fish?
When I was real young, my grandparents owned a farm on the southwest side of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and now it's all built up. But it was a trout stream. There was a trout stream that ran through it. My grandfather always said, we got to keep this water clean and pure, even though they had dairy cows and whatnot. And he really fenced off areas so, he created water gaps so cattle could water, and he was very conscientious. My grandfather on my dad's side was exactly the same way. He was a good friend of Gerald Ford, our ex-president. And Gerald Ford was a big-time conservationist many years ago. And then along the way, I met President Carter, who was huge in conservation.
And you became friends with the Carters and fished with them quite a bit over the years.
Yeah. And, he was a president that's done more for Yellowstone than any other president. in terms of what we all love, and that's protect and preserve and enhance what we have. So with that, it was kind of ingrained from day one, but yet it followed up with and Bud Lilly, catch and release, and Bud Big and Trout Unlimited, and wild trout management, him and Dick McGuire, the old guide out of Ennis, Montana. And it seems like whenever you talk to fly fishermen, everybody's in conservation. Back then they weren't so much, but they have kind of evolved. We all, I like to say we want to be good ancestors so that we can give to our kids and grandkids what we've had the privilege of experiencing.
Well, you are also a co-founder of 1% for the Planet. That's something that a lot of people know about. You did that with Yvonne Chenard from Patagonia. Talk to us about how that came about, and looking back now over all these years since 1% was launched, the impact from your perspective.
It's cool. 1% is set to break $700 million for conservation giving. Probably broke it this week. Yvonne and I have been friends for 50 years, and we're sitting on the bank of the Madison River one day, and we're talking about what our businesses did in terms of conservation. And I said, God, Yvonne, I said, we tax ourselves. I thought 1%, but my wife yelled at me one day, and she goes, we're giving 2%. She said we could take a great vacation with that extra percent. But anyway, Yvonne said, we do kind of the same thing. What are we going to do about that? So we decided we'd form a little thing called 1% for the Planet, and get businesses, like-minded businesses, and form an alliance of businesses that basically tax themselves or take from their gross sale. Now, this isn't hocus pocus net profit, because a lot of businesses never make a net profit. This is right off the top, 1% of your gross sale, and send it to a researched and approved conservation cause. And that's through 1% for the Planet. And look what you do with Yellow Dog and your community foundation. It's huge, the impact that we can all have to support what we know and love.
Yeah, and it makes a difference. We talk a lot about that on this program, and really on all levels of our business. It's giving back to the things your business depends on. I mean,
That's right.
It's so important in this day and age.
What got me is, as we're cruising along, and we're kind of struggling initially, trying to get this whole thing going, but we decided we were going to blow our own horn. We're going to really publicize 1%. And all of a sudden, I have people. One is a movie producer who, I won't mention his name because he made me promise never to, but he called me up one day and he said, is this really what you do, this 1% thing? He said, explain it to me. And I said, this is exactly what we do. We donate 1% of our gross sale, blah, blah. He said, I'm going to spend about $15,000 on this phone call with you. I said, holy moly. I said, I'm going to ship this to you on my nickel. He said, no, I'm flying up from L.A. today. I want to shake your hand. You can't buy that kind of advertising. And within a few years of our founding 1% for the Planet, and that's after we had been in business for 20 years, our business started doubling. And that's hard to do. And we'd have people walk by the front door of our shop. I'll never forget. Guys walked in, they were great customers, and one day they all walked by and they start throwing money in the front door and walking away. I said, what's that for? They said, that's because of what you guys do. Send that to the Yellowstone Cutthroat Project.
That's amazing.
That's really cool.
It is cool. And, there is, I think, a movement, an even greater movement for this mindset of philanthropic consumerism these days. People want to do business with companies that are doing good.
They sure do.
And when you participate in something, whether it's fly fishing, bird hunting, anything having to do with outdoor recreation, it matters. We have got to protect these places that we all rely on. Well, on one hand, we love them as participants and sportsmen. When we choose this for our business, we rely on these resources for the health of our business. And you've got to stay connected. And in this day and age, it's one thing to, post a social media post, hashtag conservation, but that doesn't move the needle. What moves the needle is resources that go back to protecting these places, to improving these places. We've got to do it as an industry. And really, I would say, as anybody who is a fly fisherman or an outdoor recreationalist, you've got to be involved. You got to be paying attention on this. You
sure do. I just finished a piece with a project with Quail Forever, Pheasants and Quail Forever. And we talked about, hunters supporting projects. And they've had a real hard time bringing that group into the program. But if I tell them, you've got to tell your story. It's important to tell your story. It's important to tell really the advertising quality of that 1%. It's better than giving, a lot of businesses give 3% and they advertise in a big glossy magazine, and all they do is just send out their catalogs. Where this 1% will come back to your business many, many times. So it's really fun, and it's fun to get involved with it, and it's fun to make new friends that way.
And it's fun to see how it's grown over these years.
Oh, my God, yeah.
Do you have any idea how many businesses are now involved with 1%?
There's over 3,000. We just had our World Summit, and there's over 3,000 businesses worldwide.
That's amazing. Quite an accomplishment. Well, what are some of the biggest conservation challenges facing Yellowstone's fisheries today, Craig?
Climate change is probably the biggest, and it's coming at us full throttle, double barrel. We have to be very cognizant, and we have to work on it. We have to talk about it. A lot of people, because of politics, are afraid to talk about it. Let's get over it. Science is there. Let's sit down at the table and preserve what we have left and work hard. And not only work hard, but give as much as you can, and then give a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where I'm really excited to see young people get the program. I recently did a talk to the School of Engineering at Montana State University. I don't know anything about engineering, but those kids were sure engaged with climate change. Gives us hope.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Well, along with your conservation work, you also played a pivotal role in preserving public access to the famous $3 bridge area. You mentioned that a few minutes ago. This is an iconic access point on the Madison River. In the 1990s, when the surrounding lands were at risk of being sold and subdivided, really would have restricted angler access. It's such an important and legendary part of the river. You and your wife, Jackie, helped facilitate the purchase of these critical lands, ensuring that the public would continue to enjoy this fishing spot for generations to come. Tell us about that project, Craig, and why it was important for the two of you to kind of lead the charge on that and get so involved.
Years ago, I'll never forget my old friend, Fred Harrison from Gustine, California. Fred was an old cattle rancher, and he and I would sit there and fish together and sit on the bank, and he said, someday this is going to change hands. This ain't going to be a ranch anymore. This is going to be houses every 100 feet. And I said, well, what are we going to do about it? He said, I'll tell you what. He said, if that ever happens, he said, you call me. He said, I'll buy this property. I'll buy this ranch. And it was 5,600 acres at the time, about 3 miles of the Madison River. And he said, we will do the right thing. We won't develop it, and we'll find a conservation buyer. Long story short, I went to the owner of the ranch, and I told him that. And I'll never forget, he said, this property may be worth $1 million. I said, oh, I'll bet it is. I said, but we'll get it done. And he said, someday I may have to sell it. And he said, I don't want to see it subdivided, but I'll let you know. Well, he called about 2 years later, and I said, oh, God, here we go. Well, a good friend of mine, my wife and I were on the board of the Montana Nature Conservancy at the time, and my old friend Hugh Zackheim, who worked with the Nature Conservancy, he and I had talked about this becoming a project. He said, here we go. We're going to make it a project. Well, the Nature Conservancy wasn't a fit for it because there was no endangered animals or species on it. So he left the Nature Conservancy and went to, at that time, River Network, which is now Western River Conservancy. And we started a project. We started trying to raise $5.6 million. That's what the rancher finally came up with. Not $1 million.
Not $1 million.
No, actually, he came up with $7 million, but we got him down to 5.6. And we're struggling, and we're working hard. And anyway, we bought a first writer. We bought option on it for 1 year for $250,000 that we had raised.
Buy yourself a little time.
Buy ourselves 1 year. And we're chugging along, and I had raised another $260,000. And a guy walks in our shop one day, and he goes, what the hell are you trying to do? And I told him. And he said, you're not trying to develop it. I said, no, we want to put it in a conservation easement so that anglers and hunters can forever fish and hunt this. He said, how about this? He said, how about I buy it, and I'll do an easement, and I'll never build a structure on it, and you guys... He said, how much you got raised? I said, $267,000. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll sell you an easement How much property do you need? And we had staked out, I think it was 177 acres to protect the springs and whatnot. Said, we need 177 acres. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll sell you that for $250,000, and with the $17,000 you got left over, you can build a bathroom. I said, I could just kiss you on the forehead. And since then, that family has done, I think they're over 16,000 acres now, all the way to the Idaho border is under a conservation easement.
And that $3 bridge area is still open to anglers.
Open to
still
anglers.
Iconic.
There's still a safe there. We'd like to see everybody put in $3 so we can carry another project forward. But we use that project as a model to go forward and do the Sun Ranch easement, the Granger Ranch easement. So the Madison is about 58% protected in conservation easement, the most intact valley in Montana.
That's quite a legacy to leave.
It is.
That's
yeah,
amazing.
And I'm just tickled.
That's amazing. Well, back to fishing in and around the park. What is one piece of advice, Craig, you'd give someone fly fishing either in Yellowstone or I'd say the greater Yellowstone region for the first time? Let's say they're listening to this podcast. They're thinking, I've never been out there. I'm going to do it this summer. What's your advice to anglers coming for the first time?
Read about it. There's several books. We wrote one called the Yellowstone Fly Fishing Guide, and I'm not trying to push our book, but pick up a book and read about fishing. Do as much research as you can, and it doesn't take much. Then pick a river or two. If you're going to be here a week, pick one river and get to learn that river. Don't try to fish 10 different rivers in a week. You can't do it, and as Charlie Brooks once said, you can't do it in a lifetime. So get to learn the Firehole or the Madison or the Gibbon or the Lamar. Spend some time and get to learn that river. Don't hopscotch all over. The park is just it's 3 million acres. It's way too much country to try to cover.
Another thing you told me years and years ago is that the biggest mistake people make when they're either fishing Yellowstone or even visiting Yellowstone is they're in their cars and they're driving like 100 miles an hour to get from one point to another point, to race over to this geyser and race over to the paint pots and race to this site. And they're in such a hurry that they miss what the park is all about. And
Totally.
It's the same with angling.
Yeah. They come in the shop, I'll never forget, and they say, yeah, we took all these pictures. And you say, let me see your pictures. And they're all pictures of guardrails because they're driving 100 miles an hour and they fail to see the forest for the trees.
They're racing.
Yeah. We've had people come in the shop and say, we're going to fish the Firehole this morning, then we're going to drive over and fish the Bighorn tonight. And I go, that's 360 miles. You're not going to, I didn't know it was that far. Just do a little bit of homework, ask questions, call a fly shop. Call Yellow Dog and say, hey, I want to fish this river. How do I get set up? And get a guide for one day. If you're going to be here for a week, one day for sure.
For sure.
For sure, take one day and have a guide just show you the ropes, if you will.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
Yep, and take a deep breath and just be patient for that one day. I had a fishing guide that worked for me. He was a retired highway patrolman. And many times he'd take people fishing. They'd come in after, and I'd say, how was the day? And their clients would go, God, we never fished, but we've never learned more, because he took them to a couple places, talked about it, talked a little bit about the archaeology and the whole 9 yards, and they were our best customers because of that.
They loved it. Yeah.
Yep.
Don't be afraid to appreciate what's right in front of your face.
Yep.
And not the other 10 things you think you're going to race around and see.
Exactly. And you know what? Take a walk trip. If a guide's got a boat, he's got to deal with a boat. He's got to, take a walk trip and ask. Then you can talk to the guide without him having to worry about the logistics of floating the river. I think that's really important.
Yeah, walkway trips, especially in the park. It's so
Totally.
special.
Yeah.
Well, over the years, Craig, what have you learned about trout behavior that you wish more anglers knew?
It's interesting. Trout are like quail. You flush them one time and they become a whole different creature. And these trout are flushed more than one time, believe me, with all the pressure. I'm reminded, people ask me, how long after you spook a fish do you think it feeds again? And I've studied this for a long time, and I've actually spooked fish on the Madison River, for instance, down below Hebgen Dam. If you spook a fish there, the average is about 17 minutes, and that fish will come right back to where you spooked it, and it may start feeding again. So you really got to be cognizant. You have to be careful. You just know, I see anglers run to the river, jump in, and start spraying casts all over the place. I'm sitting on the other side of the river with Brian or some friends, and we're watching fish rise. We're picking off fish like crazy. The guy across the river is running up and down the bank, and he finally sees us fighting fish. And he goes, what the heck is that guy doing? I had 3 guys come in one day. They were from Scottsdale, Arizona. And I set them up with some flies, and I set them down to the river, down by $3 Bridge. And I'm on one side of the river. They, unbeknownst to them, I can see them on the other side. I recognize them from earlier that day. And they're watching me, and we're just railing the fish on a caddis immersion. We're catching them on X caddis and Irish caddis. The next day, they walk in the shop, and I said, hey, guys, how was last night? Jesus Christ, we might have caught 1 or 2 little fish, but there were some old guys across the river. What was us? And we said, you know what you're doing wrong? You got to sit down and listen to the river and do exactly what the river tells you to do. It's like an open book, but you have to be patient and observant.
That's such great advice. People forget that. Well, any particular fishing techniques, whether it's Yellowstone or elsewhere, that you feel, Craig, are underutilized or overlooked in today's industry?
Yeah, people spend so much time. Everybody buys a drift boat now, and they float down the river and they throw 3 nymphs or 2 nymphs and they got 2 bobbers on. And I think just, again, walk a river, sit, don't even take your fly rod. Spend an hour someday, just walk the river and watch what goes on. Sit on a likely piece of water. I do this all the time in the Madison, and I just love, like yesterday, I'm sitting down along the highway, and there's 4 or 5 fish rising, and I get a couple of guys that pull over, and they're standing there, and they're watching me, and finally they bust through the snow, they come down, they go, what the hell are you doing? I said, I'm watching those fish. And they go, what fish? And I said, just sit here. They're rising literally from here to 9 feet away from me. I could hit them with my fly rod. You can get so close to these fish if you're careful. And these guys sat on the bank and they go, I don't freaking believe this. Is this the only place it happens? I say, you have to have the right kind of water. You want some slack water a foot deep that's adjacent to some heavy water. And when they're feeding on midges, they'll come into this quiet water. You want to be very quiet. But I always tell them, I want to see their eyeballs when they take my fly. And you can get that close to fish if you're careful. I scooch on my butt, I walk on my knees, and you can get right on these fish. And you can't stand there and thrash the water, splooshing down these great big bobbers, spooking the hell out of fish and expect to catch fish. Just be careful and do what the river tells you to do.
Take your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not a patient guy. That's one thing fly fishing has taught me, that and turkey hunting. Be patient.
Well, that kind of segues into my next question on things we've kind of learned, but how has the sport of fly fishing changed for you personally over the years, Craig?
I have really slowed down, and it's not because of age. Yeah, maybe it is a little bit because of age. I don't walk up the middle of the river anymore, but I just ease along the bank. I do this elk hunting too. I'm lucky in 2 things, fly fishing and elk hunting. But I just walk along very slowly, observe what's going on. I know there's trout there. I mean, if you have the right kind of water, there's fish there. And in the Madison, Yellowstone the same thing, Gallatin the same way. They concentrate, they congregate in the right kind of water type, and all you have to do is sit. You might see them flash when they take a nymph. You see a nose come up when they take a dry. When they take midges, they porpoise, the whole head comes out of the water. And people go, that fish is sick. I go, no, it's taking a midge. Why they do that, I don't know, but they'll come. Straight up. And, just watch rise forms and do what you should do. And don't hit them on the head. Lead them by a few inches or a few feet. And fish fine tippets and small flies. That's another thing. Nobody wants to midge fish. They go, oh, you can't land a big fish on a small fly. Yeah, you can.
You definitely can. Well, you've mentored and influenced countless anglers over the years, Craig. Let me ask you, who were some of the biggest influences on you when you were getting started, both, in West Yellowstone or starting the shop or going back to fly tying or even as a young kid, coming from Michigan? Who were some of your biggest influences?
As I mentioned before, my grandparents and my parents, I was very fortunate to have people that always encouraged me to pursue my sport. But when I came to Montana, and who got me to Montana the first time was an old friend. He passed away last year, Larry Deck. He was a photographer, and he worked for the phone company in Michigan. And he said, come on, we're going to Montana. And I'm glad he did. But Bud Lilly, Charlie Brooks, the Eagle family, Al Troth, Mike Lawson, Renee Harrop, my old partner, John Jurasek, they've all had an influence. Tom Brokaw, Tom McGuane, all these anglers, you can learn from. Everybody's got a different style and a different story and a different approach. And to watch people fish, I learned from little kids. I love to sit and teach a young person how to tie a fly. They come back the next day and they said, I can tie a fly now. And you say, okay, well, and you're watching them, you go, what did you just do? They develop these little kinks that we all can learn from. And it's so much fun to watch, whether they be little guys or one of the most incredible things. He was from Gallatin Gateway, I think. He passed away, but he had one arm, and this guy could fish circles around anybody. And to watch him fish and learn from him how he approached fishing with one arm and how he could cast. So again, just an observation and slow down a little bit and watch.
Yeah, good advice there. Well, looking ahead, what do you think the future holds for fly fishing in Yellowstone and the greater Yellowstone area?
If you asked me a couple years ago, I would have been I'm the eternal optimist, okay? My buddy Chenard is always saying, he's the pessimist. So we get along really
You're
well
a good
together.
pair. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm the eternal optimist. And a couple years ago, I wouldn't have said this, but as I see young people get fired up in activism and advocacy for our sport, for fighting climate change, for fighting invasive species and that sort of thing, getting involved in that, here we go, but getting involved politically to not only keep places open, but to work on securing conservation easements. I'm reminded of a couple of easements that we worked on where people said, you can't get that done. And we knocked on doors and they said, let's sit down and talk about it. And pretty soon they give you first right of refusal. And I got a big one we're working on right now. Family called up and said, it's time. What are we going to do? I said, have I got a deal for you? Let's talk about a conservation easement where you can still live there. You can still run some cows, but you get paid for that easement and everybody wins from a hunting and fishing standpoint. So that's where I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope for the fishery in Yellowstone. With the Yellowstone Resource Center, Todd Cool and his crew do such a tremendous job in Yellowstone Forever, providing funds. We all have to stand up and speak a little bit louder and a whole lot more frequently.
See, I got to make a little bit of noise these days.
You have to make
it's very
noise.
worth it.
Darn
Absolutely.
right.
Well, Craig, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice, whether it's about fly fishing or conservation or lifestyle, what do you think that piece of advice would be, knowing what you know all these years later?
I think I said this earlier. I'm the luckiest guy in the world, but there's more to it with luck. And the advice I would give is listen and learn, and again, speak up for what's right. I was always afraid, I think, initially as a young person, to say something that might upset one of the older guys.
Might ruffle feathers.
Yeah. But you know what? Sometimes it helps to have our feathers ruffled. Every now and then I need a good swift kick, and my wife usually furnishes that to get involved. It's always easy to say, let's let the other guy do this. Nope, you got to call the other guy and say, let's work together on this. And you can work across the aisle on so many things. I remember one guy up on the Missouri River, he had a head gate, an irrigator, and he was stranding thousands of fish. And everybody said, well, he'll never talk to you. I said, well, who'd you talk to? Did anybody ever go up there? No, he won't talk to you. Big sign, no trespassing. We drive in, we tell him about it. He goes, I had no idea I was doing that. He said, and now he's a fisherman. He wasn't even a fisher. He was an 80-year-old guy. Now he's an 80-year-old fly fisher. He's a maniac because he had no idea what he was doing to the fishery. And we turned that whole thing around.
Don't be afraid to speak up and say something.
Totally.
That's good advice for everybody, for sure. Well, Craig, what do you hope your legacy in the fly fishing world will be years from now?
You know, I hope that people can say, you know what, he was an activist, he advocated, he hung in there, and he was a good ancestor to all of us. You know, he tried to do the right thing, and I still try to do the right thing. And I try to lead by example, if you will. And that sounds like I'm beating my drum, but I'm not. You know, we all have to lead by example. And some people need, particularly young people, they look for you for direction. I'm reminded of young kids that used to come in the shop, and they'd say, how do I get involved? And you tell them, and boom, they would get involved. I remember kids stealing money from their parents to give to me for the $3 bridge project. Little girls walking in going, I stole this from my dad, but he loves $3.
Well, it will be a great legacy, no doubt about it. Craig, thanks again for taking the time to sit down with us today, to share your story, your insights, your knowledge of Yellowstone. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate having you here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Well, that is it for this episode of Waypoints and our very enjoyable conversation with guest Craig Mathews. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research trips, source gear, equipment, and flies for your next destination, learn about upcoming podcast episodes, and stay up to date and dialed in on the latest news in fly fishing travel and adventure. Join us for our next episode, and remember, keep fishing and keep traveling, because when it's all said and done, no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson and written by Jim Klug. Music is written and provided by bluegrass legend Woody Platt. Audio engineered by Sean McCormick. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more location profiles, destination information, travel news, and the industry's best selection of flies and equipment for destination angling.